in a world of generative AI and agentic workflows, what delegation enables is for us to take some of those maybe manual activities, manual workflows, and allow them to be delegated to a machine, an agent, a bot, whatever you want to call it. And so it allows the users, the humans in that system, to work much more effectively, much more productively. They don't need to sort of wait on another human or another user to manually execute a set of actions. They can sort of ask a bot to carry those out for them. My name is Armon Dadgar. I'm one of the co-founders of HashiCorp along with Mitchell Hashimoto, and my role there is Chief Technology Officer. So I oversee a lot of our product development, product strategy, and spend a lot of time with users and customers around the world. When we talk about delegation and the role in the DevOps space, I think one of the interesting things is when we talk about DevOps, you're often talking about people and the workflows around how they work together. So this is our application engineers working with our cloud engineers, working with our SREs. And so oftentimes there's a lot of handoffs between those things or activities that are specialized where a development team might rely on their platform team to execute something. When I think about the timing of sort of why AI makes sense in this moment with DevOps tooling, I think it comes back to sort of a confluence of a few different trends. One is the prevalence of sort of infrastructure as code and sort of the way we're doing DevOps today versus maybe 5-10 years ago. I think it historically was a lot more manual, ticket-driven, point and click. But I think as an industry, we've adopted broadly standards like infrastructure as code, like policy as code. So we've moved to this place where we're already automating these workflows using sort of a language-driven codified specification. And now you bring in sort of the breakthroughs in generative AI where we can now reason about at a much larger scale with much more sophistication these as code models. It allows us to kind of bring these techniques together and say, okay, how do I use generative AI to generate code, to synthesize it, to summarize, to update it. And so a lot of those are kind of the workflows around managing infrastructure as code that now we can start to automate using these modern AI techniques. The role of agentic platforms in sort of DevOps is interesting because it starts to bring sort of an ability to take specialized skill sets. When we think about sort of an agent-driven model, the notion is rather than sort of one super model, you would basically create a set of specialized agents that might be suitable for specific tasks. So you might say, I'm going to have a infrastructure as code agent that's really good at that, versus I might have a security agent that's really good about reasoning about security policy and access control. So it allows you to have sort of more specialized models to each of these domains. And when we think about infrastructure, it's a very large domain. It's not one thing. It's everything from infrastructure to networking to security to app deployment to monitoring and so on. So this agentic approach allows us to have agents that are both tool aware as well as domain aware, which makes them a little bit more specialized, right? And then I think then the fit into DevOps tends to be that we have a lot of workflows. And so these different agents can be trained to be sort of more specialized in the various workflows, whether it's deployment, whether it's application updates, whether it's debugging, etc. So it's sort of a nice fit into what we're solving for as a human set of workflows, but we also have a huge domain with a lot of complexity and tools, so we can kind of build specialization around those. My impression of Kubiya is sort of driven by a few things. I know the team super well. We've worked together for many years in a number of different contexts. I think one of their major strengths is they bring with them a deep understanding of the domain, right? They're former practitioners, they're former operators, so they come from the world of DevOps, from cloud automation, from workflow. And so they bring this innate understanding of what are the problems there, what are we actually trying to solve for, what are the challenges users actually face day to day. So they're taking that understanding and then building it into the product to say, okay, if I was the user, if I was the customer of this, what would I want? How would I solve for some of these things? So I think those things kind of together mean that they understand the problem really well, but then they also come from a world of understanding generative AI and the workflows there. And so marrying those together, they're able to sort of build a product that says, okay, we understand your domain and problem, but we also know your requirements around what are the controls you need, what are the sort of safeguards we need to put in place, what are the workflows we have to have and integrations we have to make this a usable product. HashiCorp's role within this space has always been a focus on how do we build great DevOps tools, right? We focus on the practitioners as our end users and really focus on how do we make great workflow and tooling for them, whether that's tools like Terraform for doing infrastructure as code and managing your infrastructure lifecycle, or tools like Vault for security lifecycle and secret management, all the way through to tools like Console for networking automation or Nomad for app deployment. So we've always focused on building these core tools, focus on end users, focus on workflows. When you think about then bringing that into a Gen AI world, obviously these tools are built around natural language specification, right? We use things like HCL, the HashiCorp configuration language. And so all these tools are naturally built around infrastructure as code as a philosophy, which makes them fit nicely into things like generative AI tooling, because now we can use generative AI to write the code, synthesize it, summarize it, refactor it, etc. I think then that next layer though is how do you build a set of user integrated workflows that takes natural language from where users want to be, maybe something like Slack, where they're already working, they're already chatting with their other teammates, and connect that set of workflows into the underlying tools like Terraform and Vault and Nomad. And that's where Kubiya is a great fit, right? As a partner, they're sort of bridging that gap to say, okay, great, we're going to build the workflows to build multi-agent systems, connect to user collaboration tools like Slack, and allow the users to build these workflows to ultimately connect to the DevOps tools they're already using, like Terraform, like Vault, like Nomad and Console. And so in that sense, I think it's a really natural fit between us. One of the great questions for us that we always get is like, how do you make tools like Terraform easier to use, lower the bar, effectively democratize the use of it? And I think the challenge when we think about things like infrastructure as code tools is, yes, they've come a long way in terms of lowering the bar, but ultimately you still have to learn a number of things. You have to understand the syntax of tools like Terraform, right? So you have to learn things like HCL. You have to understand the underlying resources that you're trying to manage, what their configuration is, their nuances, how the resources relate to one another. And then ultimately for a complex domain like cloud infrastructure, you have to understand the underlying domain, right? How am I configuring my Amazon networking, for example? And so when we think about it, there's this whole iceberg of knowledge that a user has to have to do something relatively basic, right? They might say, I just want my app running in Amazon, which sounds simple, but then you have to learn all of these other skills and knowledge and kind of nuances to figure it out. So when we think about the value of things like generative AI, it's how do we almost start from what the user's intention is, where they say, hey, I just want to run this Java app in Amazon, and then automatically connect that and say, okay, great, well, we know the best practices in terms of what your infrastructure as code should look like, because it's fairly repetitive across thousands or tens of thousands of applications doing the same thing. Can we auto-generate 90% of it, 95% of it, maybe 100% of it one day? So the goal is how do we really lower the bar so that a user coming to a system can say, great, here's my goal, just translate that to the infrastructure as code for me and I can audit it if I want to, but I don't have to. And so that makes it a much, much simpler experience in terms of the user getting started. They don't have to learn that entire iceberg of knowledge. They can just focus on the part that's over the surface, if you will. The way that Kubiya sort of aligns with industry standard tools is a super important one. I think for a lot of users, they're kind of coming into this saying, well, I have an existing infrastructure. I have, applications in cloud that I've deployed and managed with Terraform. I have security that I've set up and configured and I'm enforcing with Vault. And so I think for most users, they're not looking at saying, hey, I want to replace everything I have in my infrastructure. They're looking at it saying, how do I augment what I have, integrate with what I have to make it easier for my users, easier for my developers? And so that's where I think Kubiya has done a great job, where they're not saying, hey, throw out everything you have in your infrastructure. They're saying, we're going to come and we'll provide a user-centric workflow. So great, we'll meet your users where they are, but then we'll allow them to integrate to the tools and ecosystem that you already have. So whether that's Terraform, which is sort of a de facto standard for infrastructure as code, or other tools within the ecosystem, Kubiya's play is really focused on an integration with those things and layering on the user experience, as opposed to saying you have to replace everything you have in your infrastructure. The interesting thing when we think about automation is you would think by definition it's going to make it easier and faster for users to deliver value. Think about automation, the word itself implies, great, I'm automating some process, so a thing that took a long time should be a lot faster. The paradox of automation and the kind of funny part about it is like, that's true, but, and there's a big but there, that you have to set up the automation to begin with, right? So there's this sort of one-time tax, if you will, on, okay, I have to learn the tool, I have to learn the domain, I have to write the automation, I have to configure it and make sure it works correctly. So if you look at that, you might say, okay, well, maybe it took me 10 units of time to set up the automation, but now the automation executes in 1 unit of time. Well, that's great. If I have to do it 50 times or 100 times, I've amortized the cost. But if I was only doing it once, it was actually 10 times slower to automate it than it was to not automate it to begin with. And so I think the challenge there is oftentimes that friction means that users will sometimes avoid these tools. They'll go point and click, they'll do things in a manual way, which creates a bunch of mess for you to clean up later. So I think by pairing tools like Kubiya, what it starts to solve is that paradox where you say, okay, that upfront cost, that 10 units of time I had to invest in learning and configuring and setting this up, if I can shrink that down to 1 because the tool is automating for me, it's generating all those configurations, then that paradox sort of goes away. You can say, great, I'll use the tool to quickly get up and running. It sets up my automation, it writes the code for me, and then I might need to tweak it, but that's a much smaller unit of work than I need to do down the road. But I've at least started down the path of automation correctly rather than created a mess. I have to go clean up the mess and start with the automation later. I don't have to restart. I'm getting it 90% right the first time. I'm doing it sort of in an automated way to begin with, and with the automated tooling is sort of assisting me to get going a lot faster. For organizations considering DevOps and sort of automation of DevOps practices with, Gen AI tooling, I think it's really important to look at the different use cases you have and really understand where can I start to augment those workflows in a way that is going to be fundamentally safe, but value adding and driving productivity. And I think one of the really useful workflows to start with is internal facing things like whether it's code writing with tools like Copilot, whether it's workflow automation with things like Kubiya, because I think the nice thing about those types of workflows is human is still fundamentally in the loop, right? If I'm a developer and I'm writing code with Copilot and it generates something wrong, well, I'm in the loop. I can see that, I can fix it, I can correct for the bugs or correct for its misunderstanding. Same thing, I can leverage sort of workflow automation tooling like Kubiya to sort of simplify what my developers are doing, because great, it might get it 90%, 95% right, but there's a human there to say, okay, that last 5% I can tweak that or fix that or misunderstood what I was saying. So I think that's a really natural starting point because it's a lot safer than maybe incorporating it into a product where it's directly customer facing or user facing where there is no human in the loop, right? If the AI gets it wrong, maybe you misrepresented something to the user or you misled them to do something incorrect in the product. So I think you kind of look at those and say, okay, where is there a case where ideally humans in the loop and getting something wrong slightly is okay, but that getting it right most of the time is value saving from a productivity perspective, right? And so I think to me, it's really looking at almost internal workflows as sort of a natural starting point to sort of get going with those things and see the value of it without necessarily exposing your product or customer to risk.